Welcome and thank you for joining us for the first Future View webinar of 2020. I'm Paul Spitalis, President and CEO of APTA, the American Public Transportation Association, and I'm pleased to moderate today's webinar. We are delighted to welcome APTA members and guests from over 600 sites across North America to today's session. During the session, each of our panelists will offer about 10 minutes of remarks. After each presentation, we will follow up with a question or two. After our last speaker, we will continue our conversation with the panelists and open the floor for your questions submitted to the question box. There's a lot to learn from today's presenters. Get ready to take good notes, to post your questions to the question box found on the screen, and we will be ready to go. We'll read and address your questions aloud during the Q&A segment of the session. I am pleased to introduce today's panelists, all APTA subject matter experts who will provide their perspective on what we can expect in 2020, perhaps a little bit beyond. They are Ward McCarriger, APTA's Vice President of Government Affairs and Advocacy, Joe Nagoski, APTA's Senior Director of Educational Services, Art Gazzetti, APTA's Vice President of Mobility Initiatives and Public Policy, and Darnell Grisby, APTA's Director of Policy, Development, and Research. Before we engage our panelists, I'd like to speak to the successes of our industry in the last year, in 2019. We've closed out the 2010 decade that has fundamentally changed transportation, from ride-hail services to micro-transit solutions to scooters to bicycle shares to mobile applications that no one could have imagined in 2010. In 2019, we had some significant accomplishments that I briefly want to touch on. First, record funding wins. For the third consecutive year, Congress approved historic funding levels for our industry, and we were able to fend off application of a budget rule that would have cost the industry billions of dollars. We also enjoyed successes at the ballot box. 16 of 20 local transit funding measures were approved in 2019. That's an 80% success rate. Once again, voters have shown strong support for public transit initiatives. And since the year 2000, more than 70% of local funding measures have been approved. Very significantly, we are seeing ridership beginning to turn the corner. Nationally, ridership increased by 2.2% in 2019 third quarter compared to the third quarter of 2018. This is the second quarter in a row with an increase and the first consecutive quarters with an increase of ridership since the third and fourth quarters of 2014. Importantly, this ridership stabilization and growth is occurring despite what we've seen as wild growth among other transportation modes. Indeed, we have found that a good, solid transit system providing good, reliable service is a critical factor in the use and growth of other transit options. So we're starting the next decade from a strong place. But if there's anything we learned over the past decade, it is that change is constant and comes at us fast. So what are the trends and, importantly, the priorities for our industry over the next year? First and foremost, we're seeking healthy and robust levels of sustainable long-term infrastructure funding. The need for more public transit is growing. Systems are addressing essential state of good repair improvements, and the FAST Act expires on September 30, 2020. So we're less than 8 months away. APTA will continue to advocate for a significant increase in infrastructure investment in public transportation and passenger rail, and we will support communities with ballot measures during 2020. We'll be working to evolve, as a second priority, frontline workforce skills. 3/4 of today's CEOs say that a skilled and educated workforce is a top priority. APTA Chair Nuria Fernandez has cited this as one of our association's top goals, with special emphasis on our frontline workers. As our industry continues to change and to adapt, so do public transportation jobs and the knowledge they require. Thirdly, the changing nature of service and our industry as a whole. New technologies and new market entrants are major change agents. They're disruptors for the industry. Continued success in this environment requires increased collaboration, agility, and the seamless incorporation of new technologies. In this regard, we're seeing significant developments that affect transit service. The bus keeps getting better. Agencies across the country in diverse geographic areas are aggressively testing and deploying electric buses that emit no tailpipe emissions. We're seeing bus lanes. Cities and public transit agencies are working together to create dedicated lanes for bus and rail service. Dedicated transit lanes, as we know, help speed up service, they boost ridership, and have the potential to save agencies significant amounts of money. And we're seeing advancements in passenger rail. California's high-speed train project, a result of a successful ballot measure, is currently under construction. New privately owned organizations are developing rail corridors. Virgin Trains USA, formerly known as Brightline, operates a line in Florida that will eventually connect Miami, Orlando, and Tampa. Virgin Trains also intends to break ground on a new line connecting Las Vegas to the Los Angeles basin. Texas Central Railways is seeking to link Houston and Dallas, Texas, in under 90 minutes by high-speed rail. And we're seeing attention to congestion pricing, or also referred to as road pricing. It's garnering a lot more interest. One of the most effective ways to encourage a shift in a mode towards transit and to facilitate expanded bus service and to provide additional funding for transit is the notion of congestion or road pricing. Fourth, public transportation's role in economic development and economic mobility will be a key issue. Demand is high to live and work near transit. Thus, the cost of proximity to transit has increased dramatically in recent years. One solution is to build more public transit and transit-oriented communities. Doing so will enhance economic development and address income inequality. Decades of underbuilding and a lack of investment in housing for those with the lowest incomes have led to two crises: a lack of housing for nearly all income levels, and increasingly homeless populations that at times impact public transportation operations and services. Businesses locating near transit is another key issue. Transit creates value and as a result influences development and business location decisions. Businesses are recognizing the benefits of locating near transit to attract employees and customers and to save money on parking costs. The most visible recent example is Amazon's choice to locate their new headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, which was in part influenced by the variety and the availability of good, sound public transportation options. As we forge ahead into 2020, public transit systems will continue to do what we do better than any alternative mode, and that is move large numbers of people safely, economically, and quickly. We are the original shared economy form of transportation. We connect people to opportunities by sharing rides in vehicles that are available to everyone. The transit mode, better than any other, addresses equity and affordability in mobility. There are significant challenges ahead, of course, and we can expect those. But as public transportation, we are moving ahead, working hard to meet these challenges, to create a thriving and more dynamic future for our communities. And now I'd like to welcome our first panelist, Ward McCarriger.
Paul?
Ward, at the outset, I noted that you had quite a few slides here on some very interesting facts that you want to share with us. Why don't you go ahead and share with your perspective as we look at this issue of funding?
Thank you. So, Aptus advocacy for investment and increasing investment in public transit and passenger rail is focused on three legislative priorities: the multi-year Surface Transportation Authorization Bill, the Annual Transportation Appropriations Bill, known as the THUD or THUD Bill, and specific tax and other infrastructure financing provisions. Although these are important priorities for Congress, it is also focused on many other issues. Impeachment, trade, prescription drug pricing, and nominations are all vying for Congress's attention, and particularly the House and Senate leadership's attention. First and foremost, we are working to make the case for infrastructure to break through the myriad of other issues. And regarding the annual THUD bill, as you noted, we've had 3 historic funding years in a row in terms of the funding level. This bar chart shows the transit and rail funding under the FAST Act and THUD appropriations bills. Blue bars represent the combined transit and rail authorized level. Modest funding increases over the last 5 years. The gold bars represent the THUD appropriations, the actual funding that was provided in each of those years. And as we look at, in particular, the last 3 years, these amounts have been well above the authorized levels, from $15.4 billion to more than $16 billion. We are working to ensure that these higher funding levels reset the floor for Congress's discussion of the starting point for transit and rail funding under the FAST Act reauthorization bill. In addition to these successes, we've also had other important funding and policy victories to set the stage in 2020. Blocking the Rostenkowski test, which prevented a 12% cut to all public transit agencies this year. Repealing a $7.6 billion cut to highway funding, which would have reduced state DOT funds, like CMAQ, that are often used for transit projects. Limiting FTA's action on CIG grants, and extending the TOD authority that was expiring. Finally, enacting important changes on the commuter tax benefit and alternative fuel tax credits.
Ward, thank you. You've covered the current federal landscape well, and there's no question we've had some very impressive wins. But we also have had great success with state and local transit ballot initiatives. What do you see coming up on the ballot side in 2020?
We already have more than 20 public transit measures on the ballot in 8 different states. Moreover, you can find them all across the United States, from Portland to Orlando, Cincinnati to San Diego. Although these efforts are still coming together, historically, we've seen large numbers of state and local ballot measures in presidential election years. For instance, in 2016, $170 billion was approved for transit. In addition, many states also continue to adjust their gas tax or other revenues to increase investment in infrastructure. For all the latest information on ballot measures, please go to aptuscfte.org.
Ward, let's turn back to federal investment for a moment. After a 2-year effort, Aptus Board of Directors approved its surface transportation authorization recommendations in October of last year. Can you briefly walk us through Aptus' top priorities for the surface transportation authorization bill that we're hoping to see sometime this year?
Absolutely. Aptus' top 3 priorities are to, 1, address the pending shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund and provide $145 billion for public transit over 6 years. 2, to restore the 20% share for bus capital grants. And 3, to create a new mobility innovation and technology initiative. Touching on each of them briefly, $145 billion for public transit. Our proposal is designed to address the almost $100 billion state of good repair backlog and meet the mobility demands of growing communities. To achieve these 2 principal objectives requires $145 billion over 6 years. In addition to this transit funding, we also propose $32 billion for rail investment, including the creation of a passenger rail trust fund. Thus, in total, APTA proposes $178 billion for transit and rail over the 6-year period. 2, restoring the 20% share for bus grants. In 2012, Congress significantly cut the historical share of funding for bus. We propose to restore the 20% share by the 2nd year of the authorization bill. And 3, the Mobility Innovation Initiative. transit agencies across America are introducing cutting-edge technologies and new mobility choices in their communities. We have proposed to establish a specific initiative funded at a total of $225 million to help agencies integrate new mobility solutions into their networks.
You know, Ward, we've heard so much discussion about infrastructure in Washington over the past 3 years, and certainly on behalf of the industry, we at APTA want a bill introduced sooner rather than later. Do you expect Congress and the administration to move forward with the Surface Transportation Authorization bill this year?
Although it's always impossible to predict what Congress and the administration will agree upon, we've seen some real positive signs for FAST Act reauthorization. Last summer, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, which is the lead committee for the reauthorization bill in the Senate, passed its highway and research titles of the bill unanimously. The bill provides $287 billion of highway funding, a 27% increase over a 5-year period. It also creates 3 specific competitive and formula grant programs to address climate change, focused on resiliency, charging, and reducing carbon emissions. We've also begun to see much more aggressive behind-the-scenes work to develop infrastructure legislation from other Senate and House committees. For instance, the House Committee on Transportation Infrastructure is actively drafting its bill. These efforts are all extremely positive, and we've been actively advocating on behalf of Aptus' recommendation. As you know, the most vexing issue for the Surface Transportation Bill remains how to pay for it. And that will require the Senate and House leaderships to be actively involved in identifying the budget offsets to fund the bill. And one additional positive note is just this afternoon, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, announced that House Democrats will be unveiling, at least in some form, their infrastructure bill later this month, presumably at the end of January.
Well, that's quite exciting. As we know, authorization is first priority for us, but we also need to fund the bill. And APTA's top priority is to address the pending shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund. What's the gap, and what type of hurdle does that present to us in terms of enacting a bill this year?
Let's take a quick look at the shortfall in the trust fund. There's a $28 billion shortfall in the transit account over the next 6 years. When you look at the whole Highway Trust Fund, the shortfall is more than $100 billion. Importantly, this is the amount to fund current highway and transit levels. It doesn't provide for any of the increases. Equally important, based on the latest estimates, and as you look at the bar chart, both the highway and transit accounts will be insolvent at some point in fiscal year 2021. We face an urgent need to address the shortfall in the trust fund this year.
Well, there's no doubt we've got our work cut out for us, Ward. As you noted, APTA proposes to address the entire state of good repair backlog and to meet the mobility demands of growing communities. If Congress adopted APTA's full recommendation, and that is addressing the trust fund shortfall and increasing investment, what levels of federal transit and passenger rail funding are we looking at?
Under APTA's recommendations, we would triple the annual amount of funding over the 6-year period of the authorization. As you can see, we propose to grow transit and rail funding by $4 to $6 billion per year. Although these investments are significant increases, let's remember what they would buy us. Public transit systems across America would be in a state of good repair. The 65 capital investment grant projects under construction or in FTA's pipeline, totaling almost $24 billion, would be fully funded. And we would create millions of family wage jobs and be better positioned to compete in the global marketplace. Thanks, Paul.
Well, Ward, thank you very much. We appreciate your clear explanation of what APTA and our members are doing to ensure that we stay ahead of the curve when it comes to investment in infrastructure and public transportation. Now I want to welcome our next panelist, and that's Joe Nagoski. So, Joe, workforce development has been a priority of APTA for as long as I can remember, for many, many years. What's different as we begin this new year and this new decade relative to workforce development?
Paul, you're so right. Ensuring our workforce has the knowledge, skills, and the tools that they all need has been a priority for APTA, our executive leadership, industry leaders for many, many years. Now, however, with the fast pace of a transforming industry, hard-hitting realities of staff shortages, new technologies, new partners, and new expectations from our writers, our stakeholders, constituencies, and employees, we are now seeing a much more intensive focus from our industry members, both public and private, to be very intentionally focused to ensure that we are workforce ready at all levels.
Well, Joe, you mentioned hard-hitting realities. Are there any immediate challenges that you believe we need to provide some additional attention to?
Absolutely, Paul. Well, across the board, we're looking at around 50% of our workforce retiring in the next 10 years. For some transit agencies, 25 to 30% could retire today. For others, the numbers could be as high as 40 to 50%. And for some, they could be seeing a 50% retirement over the next 4 to 5 years. Now, keep in mind, we need to fill these vacancies, but essentially, we're all going to be competing for that same labor pool across multiple industries. And that's something to be attended to and to think about. Now, areas of shortages for today in our frontline workforce. First and foremost, the need for bus operators. Organizations such as Denver RTD are planning to cut bus routes because they don't have enough operators to provide the services. Many of our other members are working through similar issues and have had to make some tough choices. And these are commonly addressed during our conferences, our meetings, and also via APTA Connect. Now, lastly, it's not just in operations. Engineering is another high demand area for a number of our business members, but the issue there is a question of not enough on the supply side. So there's sort of a decrease in those who are currently pursuing careers in engineering.
Joe, I must tell you, everywhere I go, I hear from our public sector members, transit agencies, and our private sector, our businesses, this issue of workforce development. What do you see as some of the workforce trends as we enter this new decade?
Paul, I'd like to touch on 3 areas. First, outreach and recruitment, new partnerships, and innovative practices. As hard as it may be, we need to be more nimble in our practices by providing quicker and better opportunities for recruitment, onboarding, and bringing new staff up to speed. In addition, we need to think out of box on ways to raise awareness about our industry, especially to younger audiences. Let me share a few examples. Metro Transit recently held a one-day hiring event. More than 300 job seekers attended. Now, about 2/3 of those visitors received a conditional job offer. Metro Transit thought out of the box, they leveraged technology, they streamlined their processes and screening. They worked very hard, and they had a very, very successful day. Working with Los Angeles County, LA Metro soon will be opening a transportation boarding school for disadvantaged high school students. This new venture, being built in downtown LA, will focus part of its curricula around our industry. This is tremendously bold and a high-impact project. Last summer, Aptus business members supported a partnership program with Introducing Youth to America's Infrastructure and Washington, D.C.'s Cardozo High School to educate disadvantaged high school students about our nation's infrastructure, including a very robust week focusing on transit. Now, I recently learned of an award-winning Career Pathways Initiative partnership program with LA Trade Tech College, an APTA member, and the National Network for the Transportation Workforce, one of APTA's partners. These groups leveraged a community college GIS course. They created a hybrid GIS transportation planning course. They opened it to both community college students and high school students and provided an innovative approach to teach them about the use of GIS tools and apps and transit planning. So again, I think as you can see, there's a lot of interesting things that are happening around the country, a lot of out-of-box approaches, and a lot of great partnerships.
Joe, a few minutes ago, I mentioned the disruption of all these new technology entrants into what I'll describe as kind of the broader mobility transit space. Be curious to hear your take on these new and emerging technologies, and what do you think we need to keep an eye on as we enter this new year and this new decade?
Absolutely. Well, it should come as no surprise that three areas will keep growing and evolving: the impact of electrification, autonomous vehicles, and cyber threats. Electrification is a hot agenda. Its implications spread far and wide and impact a host of new learning and understanding from the C-suite to the front line. In fact, last fall, Aptus hosted a Future View session on electrification and initial workforce implications. More and more agencies are planning to purchase electric vehicles. Agencies themselves are on a steep learning curve. Based on conversations with a number of our industry CEOs, they themselves are needing to learn more than they expected about the utility industry. Also, operators and maintainers need to be skilled in these new technologies, including related safety practices. Autonomous vehicle research, more experimentation and testing keep making the headlines. Concurrent with pilot programs and implementations, we need to look more closely at what AV means for the industry and implications for workforce development. Well, some of today's positions need to change and be transformed. Importantly, what new skills and what new competencies do we need to consider for those supporting AV services? Again, a lot to learn and a lot to figure out. Cybersecurity threats are real and they're becoming more and more complex. Agencies are rethinking how to address not only the IT, the information technology, but also the OT, the operational technology. A few months ago, Aptus launched an e-learning cybersecurity course for executive leaders. This one-hour course is jam-packed with scenarios, case studies, and resources. No surprise, since its launch, very high interest. So again, these are some areas that I think need our attention. They're not brand new, but I think they're going to keep increasing.
Well, Joe, I think you're aware that our Aptus chair, Nuria Fernandez, has really underscored workforce development as a top priority. In particular, frontline workers. What do you see the industry going, and what Aptus should be doing over the next year to address some of these needs, all the way from our frontline workers who are so critical to our operations to the C-suite?
Paul, I'd like to touch on four areas. First, looking at sort of career and leadership academies. A lot of our members continue to pilot, develop, improve, and create new partnerships to provide programs, homegrown and regional, again, with their own staff and also area colleagues. At the academic level, community colleges and universities are also seeing the tremendous value and appeal of having career-focused academies. Again, these help individuals connect the dots. They see what skills they need, they see short-term opportunities and also long-term opportunities. Number two, I see an expansion in apprenticeship and internship programs. For example, the Transportation Learning Center, in partnership with Aptus, our members, and organized labor, and many others, has given leadership to our industry in developing apprenticeship programs and related resources for those in frontline positions at many of our agencies. In addition, some of our private sector members likewise have built and developed apprenticeship programs, especially those in manufacturing. Employees and potential employees can see the high value of these kinds of programs. These programs become both drawing cards and means for retention. You heard me mention earlier about partnership programs with middle schools, community colleges, technical schools, university consortia, and so forth. And again, I see these continuing to grow. I was at a meeting this morning and there was discussion about a transportation STEM program in the Southeast US, 400 students. Huge, huge success because of the partnerships across multiple industries. And to close, we here at Aptus will continue to support and grow Future View programs, e-learning, our flagship programs such as Leadership Apta, Emerging Leaders, our foundation, as well as many programs and workshops that we offer in conjunction with our conferences and events. And again, lastly, let's not forget the work of the Workforce Development Committee and the special frontline programs in workforce development initiatives of Aptus Chair Nuria Fernandez.
Well, Joe, thank you. That was excellent. Thank you for those insights. Our next panelist is Art Gazzetti, who will speak to the current trends involving mobility, innovation, and technology. Art?
Question?
Yes, I got to have a question for you. I believe we're seeing quite a bit more innovation and change today than certainly any point in my career, and I would venture a guess that those of us on this webinar can probably say the same, that there's so much change going on, much more than we've ever seen before. Art, can you describe some of the things that you're seeing from your vantage point? What incentives might further spark innovation in our industry?
Thank you, Paul. And I want to start with this slide, Aptus Mobility and Innovation Hub, bringing to everyone's attention a resource you can use to discover and explore the latest trends, best practices. The Mobility Innovation Hub is part of Aptus' website. You can find it there. A feature of the Mobility Innovation Hub is the Mobility Innovation Pilot of the Month. It is all at once a webinar, a deep dive into a cutting-edge topic, and it provides transferable resources that anyone, tools that anyone can use. Next up on February 6th is a webinar featuring Dayton RTD, which is taking a step to manage its own scooter share program and its own micromobility program, bike share. So they will be talking to us about that. We're going to figure this mobility landscape out one pilot project at a time, learning from each other, gathering and analyzing data and qualitative information, and figuring out new and better ways for providing mobility. Now, let me just talk. It's inspiring to see how transit industry is thinking creatively, applying new ideas, testing new technologies and service delivery models. Shown on this slide are various buzzwords, most words not in our nomenclature just 5 years ago. The dynamics here are changing weekly, if not daily. Both the public sector and the private sector are doing their best. You know, TNC, bike share, scooter share, all have had their ups and downs. Consistent thread throughout is that transit has been a backbone. A continuing trend is that transit agencies are opting to provide frequent service on routes with the highest ridership potential. Now, the need for coverage, there is a big trend to microtransit. Sometimes, app-driven, on-demand, operated often by the transit agency itself. You can go with a first mile, last mile model, such as Tri-Delta Transit is using to connect to its rail stations, or a cordon model such as used by DART. I want to mention new ways of collecting fares, the contactless credit cards, the Omni card, soon to unveil in New York. You can pay your fare through a smart device, through your contactless credit card. Very, very exciting. I do want to mention fare-free trend. The discussion has come up in numerous cities. Olympia, Washington did go fare-free on the 1st of January. Columbia, South Carolina, March 1st. And Kansas City later in the year, working on some issues. The concept here is to make it not just fare-free, but easy to use transit. Part of perhaps an effort to make transit a strategy and encouraging its use. Certainly there's a social equity component, a fare enforcement component, and a rapid boarding. You can board quicker that way. There are arguments on the other side with the need to have value in the transit trip and the foregone revenue. Health and wellness is a big trend. Can elaborate on that in our discussion. Thank you.
Or, more and more we hear this phrase, mobility as a service, also known as MOS. And there's lots of debate about what exactly that is. In the summer of 2019, just last summer, APTA led a study mission with our members to explore the international side, the international developments that are involving MOS. Can you describe for us how transit agencies are considering and adopting new service models?
Yeah, MOS is the title of this slide, but I would assert that the issue is the discussion of new technology, new startups, new mobility options, new and emerging travel behavior, and how transit agencies need to respond accordingly. The definition shown on this slide is, quote, the integration of a full range of mobility services into a single digital platform. The way you get there is one step at a time. Mobile ticketing, multimodal trip planning, things that many transit systems are doing, building their way to a MOS model, perhaps. A little more difficult issue is integrated fare payments, where many are working on that, and that will be key. But as we saw in the summer of 2020, when Aptus International Study Mission visited Vienna, Hamburg, and Helsinki, where transit systems in those cities are leading the way, it's integration not only of the digital, but significantly integration of the physical through mobility hubs where you have your bus, your rail, your bike share, your car share all come together in a physical sense. I would say another key factor, make it customer-centric. A MOS system should be easy to understand, easy to plan, easy to use, easy to pay for. Now, many places in the United States are thinking more broadly than transit alone, thinking perhaps as organizing as mobility authorities. I know that concept has come up in places like Seattle, Portland, and others. I would also say on the chart here, you do see intercity passenger rail. Paul mentioned that earlier. I would add a very significant and interesting thing came up with Virginia last year, and where their acquisition of rail lines, investing in rail lines, and making that a vibrant part of the system.
Very good, Art. Let me turn this topic to service delivery. So all of our agencies have as their overarching goal to deliver high quality service. Let's talk about ways to transform service quality. In many places, streets, highways, and the curb are constrained to the point where bus service is slow moving and unreliable. What are some of the effective strategies and new practices for giving higher priority to transit and to transit riders?
Indeed, traffic congestion continues to be a problem, and it is unfortunately worsening. The ability to provide a fast, reliable bus ride is adversely affected as a result of that. So our task is to work with cities, with MPOs, with business leaders, and to assure transit's ability to efficiently operate service and to grow its customer base. Now, in response comes one of the most exciting things of 2019 and leading into 2020. For example, Toronto, King Street, one of the main streets of Toronto, a couple years ago decided to have a car-free transitway. Now, it was started as a pilot, but they've decided in Toronto that it's been a success. It's now permanent. In New York City, many call it the miracle on 14th Street, where you have now in a bustling, in the context of a bustling city, a heavy traffic city, you have a free-flowing transit lane. And a very exciting development there in San Francisco this week. Market Street, the main street of the city, is to be a transitway, car-free. The mayor of Chicago has said, hey, I want to do some of that in my city too. And that's in addition to BRT operations in places like Minneapolis, San Diego, and many new cities there. Now, let me also mention congestion pricing and road pricing managed lanes. Los Angeles, Chicago, DC, Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, San Francisco, Philadelphia, building on New York's congestion pricing breakthrough, are seriously discussing this. Now, New York took 10 years, and it's probably going to take a while in everyone else. But think about giving travelers a free-flow transit trip, combination with a reasonably priced automobile trip, pricing either parking or a congestion charge. Think how transformational that can be to combine that. A final point I'll make is there continues to be a lot of states exploring pilots for vehicle miles traveled. That would be a surrogate for a gas tax to measure a use of the highway system. That's also an exciting trend to watch.
Art, I want to turn your attention to technology for a moment. We heard from Joe a few minutes ago talk about technology and the impacts on workforce. What are some of the trends you're seeing? Which innovations hold the most promise for improving transit service? And how can this make transit easier to both understand, to plan, to use, and to pay for? What are your thoughts?
Well, some of the key technology trends are listed here. A couple of notes here. The low-speed transit automated shuttles. We've recently done a report and identified 80. So there's a lot going on. Not all transit, but many of these are transit, many in advanced planning. Very important for driver assist. If not, it can help in many ways, including driver assist with BRT. There's spec development effort going on for a 40-foot transit bus. While the timeline for the widespread implementation of automation in the general highway system is delayed, in many ways, transit is an early adopter to some of these innovations. Another thing I would highlight here is on the clean fueled. 60% of transit buses are clean fueled, either through electric buses, CNG, hybrids, hydrogen. Compare that to 2% on the highway side. Now, another trend I want to mention is mobility data. Mobility data specifications, much discussion this week at the Transportation Research Board Conference. It's a standard way of collecting data for micro-mobility providers. It's being used by a growing number of cities and transit agencies as well. You can figure out the micro-mobility trips. How much do they really end at transit stops? How many micro-mobility trips occur parallel in bus corridors? It can lead to a better understanding and a better decision-making in transit agencies. Webinars and articles on these mobility data specifications and GTFS to help APTA and its members better understand the mobility data world.
Art, thanks for sharing that. I bet many people would not recognize that there are 80 plus demos and pilots that are going on with automated vehicle shuttles and such. So thanks for sharing that. And really also the percent of clean fuel buses in the fleet, the U.S. fleet, about 60%. So I think those really underscore the notion that transit is innovative. It is moving forward pretty aggressively in this space. Thanks again. Our final panelist is Darnell Grisby. Darnell, we'd love to hear your insights into what we can expect regarding public transportation's role, specifically in economic development and economic mobility.
Thank you, Paul. Let's start with the premise that public transportation plays a critical role in maintaining the social equity of a mobility system. This means that policy interventions should, in fact, look to strengthen public transportation service and level the playing field by ensuring that road supply is better managed and demand for mobility services is met with a diversity of offerings that are easy to access across the entire income spectrum. This also means that access should be equitable, which requires additional development near public transportation. This means both housing and jobs. We see a trend towards de facto strategic initiatives that can change how communities travel over time. The theory is a stronger public transportation system can advance social equity and the role of alternatives versus driving for every single trip.
Darnell, what do you see as some of the major trends connecting public transportation with economic mobility and development today?
I think some of the major trends would be this move towards a system that can provide additional social equity and provide alternatives to driving.
Both you and Art have kind of touched on this notion of congestion pricing, road pricing as one of the trends going forward. Are there economic mobility implications to those trends?
Absolutely. In fact, I would say that the first and foremost, this frame should look to advance equitable congestion pricing programs. Transform, a regional nonprofit think tank, published Pricing Roads and Advancing Equity last year. It identified an interesting framework with two types of equity and key measures to consider for each. A 2009 RAND technical report analyzed the various types of equity questions and proposed some clear criteria for addressing equity concerns. A few models stand out for me. First, the idea of revenue redistribution, which can be accomplished through either doing additional public transportation service or by providing a direct payment back to impacted individuals. Politically, it may be most advantageous to do both approaches to address social equity concerns. Doing so would address some of the social equity concerns noted in the Transform piece. For example, a commuter may receive a set number of credits that could be applied to use of road space or applied to other purchases if not used for driving. At the same time, this new revenue could be spent on additional bus service to provide a reasonable alternative to driving. In addition to congestion pricing, the placement of housing and jobs near transit is integral to an effective and equitable mobility system. However, decades of underbuilding and a lack of housing for those at the lowest income levels have led to multiple crises that Paul pointed out earlier. Part of the problem is what we call NIMBYism, this idea that we don't want anything built in our backyard, and that leads to a crisis of supply and affordability around the nation. We also see a trend towards reducing parking minimums, because what this does, it also allows us to have additional housing supply, which will have an impact on ridership growth. In addition to homelessness, we can also address that issue by reducing parking minimums. It does, in fact, make public transportation operations more effective and equitable. In fact, 2020 will be a year that will see a lot of progress towards building more housing near transit. One community that has done a lot is the city of Los Angeles. The city has created over 8,000 units of housing near transit since just 2017, with 1,600 of those units affordable through its Transit-Oriented Communities program, which was approved by voters back in 2016. These homes will lead to much more equitable outcomes for the citizens of Los Angeles. Furthermore, California's Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, funded by California's Cap and Trade program to address climate change, has built over 9,000 affordable units of housing in just 4 years, while funding a variety of programs to build sustainable communities near transit.
Darnell, you know, we've heard a lot about this phrase, which I find very interesting, missing middle housing. What is it, and why is it important?
The missing middle is housing that is naturally compatible in scale to communities that are currently zoned as single-family units. Think about townhomes, think about duplexes when we talk about this. These homes land in between detached family homes, single-family homes, and mid-rise apartments. These units can promote higher transit ridership, more neighborhood-serving retail, and are often more affordable. For many communities, promoting density near transit will mean, in a politically sustainable way, will mean addressing this missing middle.
You know, though there's a need for more housing near transit, without question, there's also been great success in attracting corporate headquarters. Can you respond to that?
Indeed. We know that transit creates value, and as a result, influences development and business location decisions. Many are recognizing the benefits of locating near transit to attract employees and customers. You laid out a couple of examples earlier when you talked about Amazon's choice to locate in Arlington, Virginia, which was influenced by a variety of public transportation options that are located near that choice. Speaking of suburbs, many suburbs are changing their basic makeup due to market demand. One result is known as hipsterbia. the phenomenon where suburbs are beginning to have the same hip amenities that you would find in urban communities downtown. A few examples include Santa Clara, California, and Evanston, Illinois. The trend is also known as retrofitting suburbia. You might have heard of that, a movement towards walkable hubs of activity that can be more easily connected by transit than traditional suburban-style development. Hipsterbia oftentimes will mean you get great urban amenities like later hours for the bars and restaurants and actual culture. Now, of course, driving this change in our economy, this on-demand culture that we have, really requires a lot of late shift workers. APTA, in fact, researched this phenomenon and found that the economic importance of late shift workers and the late night transit that serves them is extraordinarily important to the U.S. economy. In fact, these workers earn $28 billion in wages per year and account for $84 billion in sales per year. So this is a very important constituency group that should be looked at by everyone. In fact, in America growing more diverse every day, these workers are disproportionately people of color. Latinos and African Americans make up about 39% of the daytime workforce, but account for the majority of late night workers. In our society, social equity and inclusion are no longer a nice to have nor an addition, but rather a key piece to the politics and policy of the future. 2020 will make this abundantly clear.
Darnell, thank you. I must say, I've got a new word now that I'm going to be referring to, hipsterbia. I'm liking that. I think it's kind of cool. At least it sounds cool. All right, well, now it's time to involve our audience. If anyone on the webinar today has a question for our panel members, you can submit your questions via the question box that's found on your screen. We will read your questions aloud, direct them to our panel members, and we'll do our very best to answer all of your questions. So it's a great time to really continue this dialogue now with our audience and our panel members. So let me start with a question. And Ward, I'm going to put it your way. The question is, you just mentioned Speaker Pelosi, talking about introduction of a bill. Is there anything that you can share beyond that? And is this really the opening, meaning that do you see others that will be stepping forward to introduce a transit bill or a reauthorization bill in the next few months?
Well, I can't speak to the specifics of what the speaker's plan is, but I would say two things. One is we're beginning to see some real active movement this year. This could clearly become a year for infrastructure. Now, whether they can get to that, a bill signing, we're not to that point. But I think what we're likely to see, and this is more based on just my experience, not what I've heard on Capitol Hill right now, is based on my experience, having worked up there for a long time, is I would expect that the unveiling we'll see in the next, hopefully next 2 weeks, will be a broad infrastructure bill, but what will be unveiled will be very high level. Now, behind the scenes, I know that both the House and the other Senate committees who haven't acted, including the Senate Banking Committee that does transit, are actively working to draft bills that would actually move forward. We have heard some very positive signs that the House is thinking about moving this bill later this spring, and a likely time when you think about the way infrastructure works, people want to have that in place late in the spring before the construction season. So, hopefully we would see House action on something by May.
Okay. Thank you, Ward. Let me take another question from the audience. This reads, can your workforce strategies reach out to individuals with disabilities? This is out of the box. There is a huge pool of qualified individuals with disabilities that can fill transit-related positions. Joe, might you want to comment on that?
Thank you, Paul. I think that's an excellent question. As a matter of fact, this morning, APTA hosted an international group that looks at providing the right level of accessible needs for individuals who are differently abled. I think from our side, relative as employers, and in terms of the kinds of programs that we create, we can really take a look at a high level and also deep dive, because this is important for all of our members. It's also one of our priorities. And so I see the question part of our bigger picture as we look at the year ahead.
Okay. Let me take another question from the audience. The question is, what trends do you foresee as it relates to climate resiliency in the transportation industry? And let me throw that open to the entire panel here, whoever wants to take that. So again, the question is, what trends do you foresee as it relates to climate resiliency in the transportation industry?
Well, I'll make one comment on that, and that's that certainly, we need to plan our assets, approach it that way. We have to build things a little differently than we perhaps did in the past, make the engineering a little higher level, make the assets a little harder and withstand climate extremes. So that's one comment. Another comment would be transit is certainly part of a energy efficiency solution. Cities should embrace transit as part of a strategy for energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction. Also, I would say that transit systems are very proud of the level they operate under sustainability practices. We recognize them accordingly. The way they operate their service, the way they design their buildings, the way they fuel their operations is all part of making a transit system a sustainable element that can then lend itself to a regional sustainability priority.
And if I could add a point on climate from the federal kind of legislative perspective, as I mentioned, the Senate Environment Committee included, 3 specific climate programs in the bill that they moved regarding highways. That passed unanimously from the committee. I think we will see something, but the politics of climate in the House and Senate are often difficult. And I think the issue that moving forward in the Senate has actually complicated the House moving forward in terms of climate. Likely the House Democrats will want to be even more aggressive than what was included in the Senate bill, and that is hard to reach a bipartisan compromise on some of those issues.
Yes. Oh, if I can add a little bit. We actually had a conversation, maybe not exactly in this arena, with the Leadership Aptus class this past December. And part of it was around the arena of resiliency, and part of it is in terms of areas of preparedness and communication. Now, I know these are kind of our broader level, but I think as you think about this and drill down, what are you doing both at the operational level, at the management level, at the coordination level? And again, all those speak to planning, different levels of skills, and different levels of partnerships.
Very good, thank you. Let me make one mention, because I know that many of our audience here are good APTA members, and they know our APTA team very well. And that is to say that Pam Boswell was originally scheduled to be part of our panel, and unfortunately had to withdraw. And so Joe Nagoski has ably stepped in, but we do miss Pam for being part of our session today. Let me follow up with this question. It really has to do with technology. One of our audience members writes in our question, what is going on in regards to bus testing and preparing for automated buses? Let me direct that, Art, to you, and perhaps Darnell in particular, or really for anyone that might have an interest to take that question. So what's happening with regards to bus testing and preparing for automated buses?
I just have to answer that in a general way, and that's that the law provides that new bus models be tested, and that this would fall under that same category, that would have to be tested as a new significant feature on a bus.
And Art, I think I can add to that, to what you just shared, and that is, it was just in the last quarter, I believe, of this past year, that we at APTA established a new committee, a connected and autonomous vehicle committee, specifically to address this issue. So we brought together agency personnel and the private sector really to address this issue. How can we best move the industry forward to try these different technologies? What are some of the protocols that we need to be engaged in? So it is a very recent addition to our committee roster, and it's gotten a lot of attention. I think the last meeting had well over 70 attendees for the meeting. So I think we're going to be making some progress in this area. Let me turn to another question from the audience. And let's see. What is the likelihood of greater involvement of the public in the planning of public transportation? This could be very important in terms of locating new lines and modes for public transportation. So again, the question, what's the likelihood of greater involvement of the public in the planning of public transportation? Could be very important in terms of locating new lines and so forth.
You know, one comment I would make on that, and public involvement has always been important, but I'm hearing a lot of people talking differently about public involvement. It's hey, unfortunately, in too many occasions, been a check the box exercise, and I've heard a lot of APTA members and committees saying that's not the way it should be. Let's talk their language. Let's not talk planning speak that doesn't really connect with them. Let's make sure we're focusing in on what matters most to them. I know one committee I'd like to flag in particular is a newly renamed committee, Aptus Transit-Oriented Communities Committee, that sort of looks at transit as its broader relationship with the community and how it can impact.
I think I would add in too that not just transit, but housing developers, people who are doing other infrastructure have noted that there's a need to update our ways of communicating with the public and getting public input to make sure that we can actually advance projects more quickly. So I think other industries might also be interested in this conversation because it's a national problem.
One additional factor on public involvement is, it's required right now under law through the NEPA process with regard to specific projects. Last week, the administration put out a really significant revision of NEPA through a proposed rule. And it's a 150-page proposed rule, but APTA is collecting comments from our members on that right now, and will likely submit comments in early March. So if you have views on that and how that affects the public involvement process, please let us know as we develop what will be APTA consensus positions to submit to the administration.
Another question from the audience, and Darnell, I think this is directed to you. The question is, can you elaborate on missing middle housing and discuss the connection between transportation development and affordable housing? What needs to be done to fill the gap?
Yeah, I think missing middle housing is oftentimes banned in communities around the country, so you can't actually build it. So much of what exists is actually what we call grandfathered in already. The housing tends to be slightly more affordable than you would get from single family or from some of the mid-rise product that's being developed, particularly when you move from stick-built to steel. Is much more expensive. It also partially is connected to parking because of parking minimums around the country. These types of missing middle housing cannot adapt to a high requirement for parking minimums. So getting back to how we used to build 50 years ago, going back to the future is part of the answer. Reducing parking minimums, allowing more of this missing middle housing, which, like I said, is banned in a lot of communities around the country, would promote affordability. And what that does for transit is, as you slowly upgrade density in hard-to-serve communities, it'll become easier to serve those communities with transit because of that additional density. And you'll attract additional retail, neighborhood-serving retail to the spines of that community, which means that you might be able to attract additional riders that way as well, not just from housing density, but also from retail. So it could be important for us to have a voice in those conversations in your local communities.
Thanks, Darnell. Another question from the audience, and that is, could you talk further about free fare initiatives? What's the policy and financial justification?
Yeah, it's... First of all, it's a local decision. It has to be considered locally. There is a pretty healthy dialogue, but I would say there's points on both sides, and let me briefly mention them. Again, I think it's a lot of times we have to make transit easy to use. And a lot of times when you're fumbling for your change or trying to figure out how to pay for your fare, sometimes that's not easy. So I think sometimes we look at places where free fare is in operation. It's not really a new idea. It is under heightened discussion, but it's always existed in universities, in certain downtown zones, in resort communities. In Denver, for example, their transit mall has free fare, and when you look at that, people jump on and off of that bus freely without worrying. Do I have my card with me? So that's one factor. There is a social equity element to it. There is an enforcement aspect. I understand 60%, through some statistics, 60% of operator assaults are related to fares. So is that an issue? Rapid boarding is another thing. If you can board the bus quicker because people don't have to worry about paying their fare, that's a big advantage. So those are all issues on the side of considering free fare, not to mention ridership growth, again, reiterating equity, that. Now, let me say on the other side, if you're going to do fare-free program and it is at the expense of anything you do, not a good idea, I don't believe. I mean, you have to make transit better. It shouldn't be at the expense of the frequency of your transit. It shouldn't be, it should be part of a package one would hold to make your system better, not cut corners on your system. You really should replace that revenue through some source that's coming your way. Another issue about, on the adverse side of free fare would be, should there be some user fee? Should the user pay at least some part of it? It's certainly reasonable that transit be subsidized for all the benefits we bring to communities. But if you don't pay anything at all, do you value the trip? And you also get the idea, well, if people can ride free, will people ride just to ride? So all of those factors on both sides of the equation, but it is a topic of increased discussion. Oh, one other factor I would say, we're in a decreasing cash world. It's becoming a cashless society in many ways. Now, it's probably not going to go away totally. That's part of the issue here. But I'm trying to get a handle on how much. But I understand some systems, it's 15%. They're down 15% of their revenue actually is in the form of cash or less. So at what point do you say, well, does it make sense to have all this fare collection, fiduciary control, and hardware to collect fares? That's a pretty long answer, but I wanted to cover, it is such a hot topic, I wanted to cover both the pros and the cons.
Thank you, Art. Another question from the audience. The question reads, the public and politicians are excited about electric buses, but the cost for infrastructure to support those buses is very expensive. How do we get support for the funding? Let me take a crack at this one, then I'm looking to our panel members for anything they want to chime in, because there's a lot of dimensions to this. There's no doubt about it that an electric bus today compared to a more traditional, diesel-powered bus is roughly twice the cost, and that doesn't include the infrastructure, the charging that has to be included as part of that. I believe the industry is making great strides in terms of finding ways to reduce those costs. As we scale up and get more electric buses in the national fleet, as agencies begin to do so, as additional innovations arise relative to charging, I do believe that in the longer run here, we're going to get these costs come down a bit. Now, whether they approach the levels of more our traditional buses is another question. But however, I think with the funding that we're looking at in terms of the federal level, we are looking for more attention to clean energy, to clean solutions. And so that may be a source. I will point out as well that a number of localities, states, California certainly in particular, has really stepped up to incentivize looking at these alternate propulsion technologies like electric buses. So I'm just looking to my team here to see if anybody wants to add anything to that.
I would say that the strategy that they're employing here is greater demand would lead to a market that is more efficient So they're doing this with trucking, they're doing this with cleaning up ports. So I think we're just part of that conversation. But the notion is, if you get enough demand going, the market will adjust and the prices will come down, like Paul said, and the quality will go up. That's the theory. Now, whether or not that works, we'll see. But
Okay, excellent, thank you. Another question from the audience, and this one reads, what are the trends as far as how ride-hailing services are affecting transit? Benefits and partnerships, question mark. Challenges and competition, question. Who would like to address that one?
I'll offer a thought. There might be other perspectives on it. And hey, one point is that their options are a good thing in general. We are part of a mobility ecosystem with a lot of parts. A lot of partnerships have formed from that. Having said that, there probably are instances where ride-hailing has adversely affected ridership, and I think we have proof of that. We got to figure out ways to minimize that or eliminate it, and ways to build on the power of partnerships and find synergies.
To add to what Art is saying, which I think is spot on, I think one of the ways to do that is to have more bus lanes, which we talk a lot about, bus priority. So since the bus is still the workhorse of our systems, generally speaking, improving that would mean we're more competitive against our new competitors. And that probably is the route to take. We know that they're having financial issues, but will they go away anytime soon? Probably not.
I would just add, I agree with my colleagues in terms of what they shared. Another perspective that I have on this is that, we look at these services today, the ride-hail services, whether it's Uber and Lyft, and kind of believe that what exists today is the way it's going to be. And in fact, what we're seeing is that their business models are changing, if not every day, every other week or so. And so we're very early in this game. And I think that we've got much to see in terms of additional changes of their business models, and in turn how that affects transit, but also how transit responds. And I think we've seen over the last couple of years in particular, transit agencies are really being aggressive. They're looking not only for partnerships, but they're also looking for ways that they can serve their customer better. So I think it's a healthy change. As an industry, we're embracing these challenges. And I think in the long term, it'll be for the benefit of the communities and the riders that we serve. So we have come to the close of our webinar today. I do want to thank everyone on the line for participating, for giving of your time. I hope you found it very enlightening. I know that we've enjoyed, from the Aptus side, of participating with you. I do want to thank our team here at APTA, Ward, Joe, Art, and Darnell for their participation, and really to you all as the audience for taking the time to be with us. All of these questions and topics that we covered today are of great interest. There's a lot of work to be done, a lot of challenges ahead, but I think that we feel very strongly here, and I hope you do as well, that transit has a very, very bright future, an exciting future. It will take all of us, the public sector, the public agencies, and the private sector working together to really devise good solutions for our communities and for our riders. That's what we want. So with that, let me end with a commercial. Our AptaView Next Future View series webinar will focus on taking back the streets, prioritizing transit through city partnerships. The webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, March the 11th from 3 to 4:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And we hope you'll be able to join us in this session and future sessions. So thank you again for participating. We do look forward to participating with you again in the near future.